Hello, my name is Alex Johnson, and this is a very special, limited series Fintech Takes podcast called What Customers Want. Fintech has always had a bit of a complicated relationship with customer service. Fintech companies are famously customer obsessed. That customer obsession manifests in ways both obvious, features like 2-day early access to your paycheck, and subtle. My favorite example being a random compliance-mandated disclosure email that Simple, the OG neobank, sent me a long time ago and that I still think about today because it was that well written. However, strangely, fintech companies' customer obsession hasn't always extended to customer service. I'm not sure why this is, to be honest. It might have something to do with fintech companies' focus on competing with banks on a cost basis. Digital self-service processes are much cheaper than people-heavy processes like running a call center. Or it might be the stereotypical perfectionism of folks who build software products for a living, and who believe that if the product is working well, customers should never call in with a problem. Regardless, customer service in fintech is often treated as a problem to be cost-effectively engineered around. However, as the fintech industry continues to mature, and more companies reach a scale that is truly competitive with banks, this attitude will need to evolve. The simple truth is that in financial services, customer service interactions aren't always a problem to be engineered around. They are sometimes a critical opportunity to build trust. Not every problem can be solved with an FAQ page or a chatbot, and even the ones that can be, sometimes shouldn't be. Sometimes people just want to talk to other people about what's going on with their money. The question I'm fascinated with is how can fintech companies adapt to this truth? How can they take a more sophisticated and mature approach to customer service while also maintaining the competitive differentiation from banks that they've worked so hard to build? Building branches probably isn't the right answer. But what is the right answer? What are the best practices? That's what this series, What Customers Want, is all about. Over the next 4 episodes, we're going to explore how fintech companies are solving for common and not so common customer service challenges in financial services. We're going to talk about BaaS and Reg E and generative AI. We're going to learn about cutting-edge technologies, but we're also going to reflect on timeless truths about humans and the complicated, often illogical ways they think about money. This podcast series is sponsored by Ubiquity, and I'm going to be joined over these next 4 episodes by Corey Besaw, president of APAC and one of the founders of Ubiquity. In this episode, Corey and I chat about what customer service stacks look like in financial services, why not all customer service calls are bugs, and how fintech companies can apply the principles of value engineering to improve both customer outcomes and their own bottom lines. So, without further ado, I present What Customers Want. Corey, thank you for joining me today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Alex.
Absolutely. Well, this is a topic that I can't wait to dig into. It's something, as I mentioned in the intro, that I'm personally kind of obsessed with, but have never really spoken to anyone who's a practitioner in the space. And so I'm looking forward to kind of peeling back some layers on this question of how fintech companies think about customer service and how customer service as a discipline within fintech is evolving. So let's start at kind of a philosophical level. How do you think that fintech companies tend to think about or view customer service? What's their sort of, in general, kind of philosophical perspective on customer service and how they approach that task?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And, I'm lucky I work with almost 100 different fintech brands in some capacity or another. So, it's not a monolith, right? But I would say that in general, a lot of fintechs kind of look at customer service as a necessary evil and something that they try to engineer out of the product as much as possible by, thinking about, well, how can we make the, kind of our self-service options, especially our mobile app, as kind of fully featured and easy to use as possible? How can we try to design the product in such a way that, hopefully is very easy for people to understand and doesn't require contacts? A lot of times that's kind of the emphasis is just, let's try to engineer the need for service out of the product as much as we possibly can.
Yep. Yep. Well, and so I'm glad you described it exactly that way because that's what I've seen as well from fintech companies. And again, I'm not a practitioner in this space, and so this is more an observation from 30,000 feet. But engineering it out, I think, is a really great way to describe it. And it's interesting because in some ways, I can see the virtues of that approach, right? Like, I really do like the idea that we're going to work extraordinarily hard to make sure that the product we're building doesn't create customer service problems that shouldn't exist in the first place, right? And so the discipline about building and constantly iterating to create the best possible product, which will minimize the number of sort of customer service interactions. I really like that. And I've even heard, and you probably have seen a lot of this yourself, that customer service is often treated, I think, as like an iterative product development loop or input into the product development process, where a big part of the fintech iteration on a product is, hey, let's look at all the customer service tickets that we're getting. And are there any here that seem to be kind of consistently generated based on some way that people are using or misusing the product, or the product is breaking in some way? And if so, let's prioritize that as a way to fix the product. So I think there is a really kind of positive side to this. And it's interesting because I think that, and I'd love your take on this, it's pretty different than the way that banks, I think, have historically thought about customer service. Can you sort of contrast? Because I know you have a history working on the banking and payment side as well. How does this differ from the way banks look at this process?
Well, in a way, I would say fintechs are more customer centric in the sense that they're looking at how are customers likely to interact with the product, and maybe
Yes.
we'll start there, right?
Hmm.
Whereas I think banks tend to be a little bit more process driven, where they start with what do the regulations say,
Yep.
what processes suit us based on systems, and I think banks have a lot of legacy systems to contend with. So
Yeah.
I know a lot of people in the banking space that would love to do certain things that they know would be positive from a customer facing standpoint, could make good business sense, but they don't necessarily have the technical capability to pull those things off. But in a lot of cases it's that banks are looking at it kind of from a different perspective. We have to satisfy our regulators, we have to work within a often legacy technical framework that we're working on, and we've got a lot of internal constituents on the corporate compliance and risk management side, and product teams are often pretty separated from customer service teams. They're really large organizations, so often you have people developing product and process within a bank that really aren't necessarily thinking about downstream things like customer service. So then you end up with a customer experience that can sometimes be frustrating for a customer. But on the other hand, banks often, traditional banks have the benefit of a branch network, which can assuage some of that friction that might exist. So there are advantages and disadvantages for each.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you mentioned the branch specifically because that is something that I think is one of those sort of really clear examples of the different models that are kind of crashing together right now in financial services. But yeah, I mean, from the branch perspective, and this applies not just to the branch, but all of the, I guess, sort of service infrastructure that banks have invested in over the many decades that they've been in existence. They have these resources that are sitting there, right? And so I do think part of the mentality from a bank perspective is obviously they start from regulation, they start from process. What are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? How do we minimize risk? But then I think when it comes to product, kind of to your point, they don't necessarily think in terms of like we have to engineer a product that's going to generate zero customer service inquiries because we have this safety net that people can fall back on. So if a product doesn't work perfectly, someone can always come into the branch and they can always fix that issue. They can always call into the call center, and we have these branches and these call centers staffed regardless of how many people come in. And so to a certain degree, like having the safety net, might as well have some people need to use it every once in a while. Like there's less of that imperative, it seems. The flip side to all of this, though, that I think is really important, and you and I were talking about this a bit when we were prepping for this podcast, all of this can sometimes get a little disconnected from what the customer actually wants, which is, it's funny, right? I think that, if I was to tweak what you would say about fintech being customer oriented, and I do think they are customer oriented, but in a lot of ways, they're customer oriented from a product lens. Like, we're really product focused, and we think if we build the best product, it's going to create the best outcome for customers. And I think, the way you sort of illustrated this impact that fintech philosophies can have on customer service, one of the challenges I would think in trying to sort of say we're going to engineer as much customer service out of this as possible is that that's not always 100% aligned with what customers want, even if it actually is kind of technically possible. What's been your sort of observation on the customer front?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think there are two important things here, right? So first is that no matter how well you engineer, product and systems and process, there will be things that go wrong and there will be reasons why customers have to contact you, right?
Yeah.
The second part is you have to realize that money is, for a lot of people, one of the most emotional things in their life, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, there's such a connection to it, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
so important for
Mm-hmm.
people.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of fintechs are filling a market niche. That means that, they're often the primary bank account for people, sometimes only the bank account for someone, right? And so when it doesn't work or doesn't work as expected, it's a huge issue, and an issue that, again, without the branch network, can be a little bit harder for customers to resolve. But even when everything could be self-serviced, because money is such an emotional thing, and we see this all the time, we talk to customers who are fully aware that the reason that they're calling could be resolved on their own in a mobile app. They know how to do it. However, they're looking for the comfort of talking to a human being. And that's
Mm-hmm.
especially true in, moments where, something has gone wrong. There might be fraud,
Mm-hmm.
fraudulent use of an account, or they're just trying to conduct a really large transaction, and they, want to feel confident that everything is set up as expected, or they're trying to set up, some kind of recurring bill payment. And again, they want the comfort of a human to tell them, like, yes, you've set this up correctly. I can see it on my end. This is going to happen as you've set it up. You can show people that on a screen all day long, but for a lot of people, until they hear it from a person, it just isn't satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's extraordinarily well said. And I will say that just personally, and a lot of times with this stuff, I fall back to like my own experiences as a consumer, transacting in the financial services ecosystem. I've had the exact experience you describe, right? Which is, I'm setting up auto payments with my new mortgage servicer, or I'm rolling over a balance off an old 401k into my existing 401k account. There are these like moments where I can do the entire process digitally, self-service. I never have to talk to anyone. I never have to have any interaction. I'm in complete and total control. And it's not like the interfaces that fintech companies or banks, for that matter, build to enable that self-service are bad, or are like giving me signals that, man, maybe like this didn't work or it didn't load in some way. Sometimes that happens, but a lot of times it's like, wow, that was really smooth. I was able to handle everything. And yet there's this nagging thing in the back of my mind, which is like, that's a significant chunk of my retirement that I just rolled over into this new account. And I really don't want to even take a 0.5% chance that I screwed something up or that something went wrong. I would like to talk to someone and just have them confirm that this happened. And it's interesting because I could imagine, particularly from a fintech perspective, this view of that where it's like, hey, he called the call center. Something must be wrong. Like, he must not understand how to do this, or maybe there was something wrong with the product that like caused him to do this. And the reality might be as simple as you say, which is, no, everything went great. I'd like double confirmation on this thing because this is really important to me.
Absolutely. And that's one of the challenges that, honestly, that's a conversation that I have with my fintech partners pretty
I'm
regularly.
sure.
which is to say, not every call is a defect. And I think that's kind of the engineering mindset that can come into play where,
Totally.
they start from a place of every contact is a defect and a
Yep.
defect that needs to be engineered out. And you kind of, you said it before, of course, people are going to look at why are calls happening or
Mm-hmm.
emails, chats, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then how can we engineer the product differently to prevent that? And
Mm-hmm.
that's a good thing to do, right?
For sure.
Because customers want to call when they want to call. And what I mean by that is no one wants to be forced to call. So it's a good
Right.
instinct to try to engineer out reasons for contacts, but you have to recognize that not every contact is a defect. A lot of
Yeah.
them are actually not a defect. They're just normal human behavior, which is to
Yeah.
say a desire for that human connection, that comfort, to say, yeah, everything's going to be fine, don't worry.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the other point I would add to that is that this is one of those things that is sort of stubbornly resistant to other demographic or technological trends, right? And so I think a lot of times, I'd be curious for your take on this as well, because I know you guys work in financial services, but you also work in other industries as well. One of the things I notice is there'll be a lot of trends that happen in other markets where there'll be something that's happening where it's like, oh my gosh, look what they're doing in e-commerce, this is amazing, let's apply this in financial services. I mean, this story is going to date me, I guess, now for our Gen Z listeners. But like when Uber was a new thing, I remember there was this whole conversation in financial services about like what's the Uber model for banking and for fintech, and like how do we like
Yeah.
strip out all the cost and all of the inefficiencies around this. And again, to your point, it's a good instinct, but financial services is very, very different. In fact, I think the only other industry I've come across that's similar to financial services in terms of like that deep sort of need for kind of an emotional like reassurance and kind of human connection is healthcare, right? I think your health is really the only thing that's kind of at parallel or higher to your money in terms of its like emotional importance and sort of the need for trust and reassurance. And I think the other thing, and I'd be curious to get your take on this real quick, is as it relates to demographic trends, I think there's also this instinct in financial services to say, well, yeah, people over 40 want to call into a call center. Baby boomers who have nothing better to do because they're retired want to call into a call center because they have all the time in the world. But younger consumers, Gen Z, they have no interest in talking to someone. And what's interesting from my perspective, and I'd be curious to hear like what you talk about with your fintech clients on this front, is according to like surveys, Gen Z is actually one of the most enthusiastic about talking to human beings.
Yeah.
As it relates to financial services. And that can be for customer service, it can be for just education and learning about things. But, despite Gen Z's fondness for technology and familiarity with self service and digital and chatbots, they actually really get a lot more value in some ways out of talking to a human being because a lot of this stuff is new and they've never like had to deal with these things before. This might be the first time they've had this issue with their finances, and absent talking to a parent about it or a friend, like they need someone to talk to about this. So what's been kind of your observation on that front?
Yeah, fascinating. So um, I can remember some years ago we were working with a partner who was launching a product that was specifically targeted to a young demographic, certainly Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
And the going in assumption, I would say, on
Yeah.
that was that chat was going to be the primary means of communication. There was also a belief that, providing chat specifically via social media channels, right? Like say
Mm-hmm.
Instagram, that sort
I
of thing.
remember this as a bit of a trend.
Really
Yeah, yeah,
important.
yeah.
And what we found was that the actual utilization rates were very low on chat,
Mm,
and that people did in fact want to call. And when we did have people interact via chat, we
yeah.
found that in a lot of cases it was difficult to resolve the inquiry fully, and that a good number of those resulted in a phone call to
Mm,
the. And that's been the case for many of our clients, so much so that we've had a number of clients either discontinue chat entirely as a channel in some
Mm-hmm.
cases, or
Mm-hmm.
limit it to a very specific set of use cases,
Mm-hmm.
effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it really is fascinating that the generation that kind of grew up with a smartphone in their hand
Yeah.
really is one of the more likely to call. In fact, we have a lot of people over 40 who are probably as likely or more to use chat than people in the younger demographics.
Well, that's
So
just the thing, right? Like I was gonna say, like I'm an old millennial. I'm a really old soul, Corey. And one of the things that I've come to realize about myself at this stage in my life is I have 3 young kids at home, full time job, bunch of other responsibilities. I have about 30 minutes of free time a day, right? That's like the maximum amount of time I have to myself. And so for me, my interest in self-service and chat and automation has nothing to do with the fact that like I grew up in the age of the internet. I'm sort of a native digital user. Like that's all nonsense to me. The determining factor to me is where I am in my life and how much like free time I have relative to the problems I'm trying to solve. And so for me, like automation, chat, self-service, hugely valuable, not because it's digital, but because I have no free time. That's very different, I would imagine, than either consumers who are younger than me, who are not quite at that stage in their lives, or folks who are older than me who their kids are out of the house, they're in college, they've gotten a little bit of their free time back, but like I always like to think about it more in terms of life stage in some ways than like generations.
yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And you hit on something there that I think is really important, which
Yeah.
is the kind of convenience factor for a customer, which is to
Yeah.
say you've got to meet them where they are
Hmm.
when they want to be there, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the argument. To me, that's the argument for chat. A lot of people look at it and say like, hey, here's maybe an opportunity to build a really cost-effective solution, and that can
Hmm.
sometimes be the case. And obviously, building a chatbot is easier than building a conversational voice AI,
Right. Right.
bot. So there's kind of that benefit of chat as well. And we can talk more about automation.
Yeah.
But just purely from the standpoint of a channel, I would say the
Hmm.
reason to do chat is less cost and more of meeting the customer where they want to be when they want to be there. In
Hmm.
other words, the convenience factor. So I think you're right. I think that is a big driver for when people are using chat. It's often not because they're, savvy, to digital
Right.
interactions. It's because for them, it happens to be actually the most convenient thing at that moment. But
Hmm.
that's, often not the case. And again, going back to the emotional side of things,
Hmm.
you know, it often is less satisfying than the sound of a voice on the other end
Oh,
providing that
totally.
kind of reassurance.
Yeah. No, I could not agree more with you. And again, like I some of this stuff isn't logical. I mean, that's the thing that's so fun about working in financial services is, there's no reason for me as a consumer to rationally think, hey, this self-service tool I just used to conduct this transaction that worked great and was super smooth and gave me every possible UX prompt and reassurance as I was going through it. There's no logical reason for me to think that didn't work, but I still kind of think it didn't work. Or, there's no reason to feel unsatisfied about I have this experience sometimes when I'm traveling, right? Slightly different industry, but like travel sometimes is very high stakes in a way that's scary or emotionally sort of resonant. There's no reason to think that me like chatting with the Delta app is going to lead to a worse resolution than me talking to someone on the phone. And yet I still kind of believe that it's going to lead to a slightly worse resolution than if I got someone on the phone. So I do definitely think that we have to keep that human element in mind. I'm glad that you mentioned the different channels because I want to segue into a discussion about channels because again, not a practitioner, so I need you to educate me a little bit here. When you are sitting down with a fintech company and sort of mapping out the different options that are available in terms of like, okay, you have a product, you have a strategy for how you're going to handle customer service. We have all these different tools and all these different channels available. What's the sort of way you lay out the different options? Can you walk us through kind of what that stack of different tools looks like and sort of in general where each is kind of best used?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, the channels are kind of what you would expect them to be at a high level. There's
Yeah.
email, there's chat in various forms, which is both, what I would call kind of synchronous and asynchronous chat. And
Yep. Yep.
synchronous is kind of the old style, like, you know, pop up on the screen,
Yep.
chatting with someone in real time.
Mm-hmm.
Asynchronous adds more flexibility to, for the customer, meet them,
Mm-hmm.
where they are when they want to be there,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be implemented via SMS. It could be implemented via an in-app
Yep.
chat. It could be implemented via, messenger apps, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, and there's voice. Um, Now, I would say that voice is certainly the most expensive of those channels to
Yep.
implement for a
Yep.
number of different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But we spend a lot of time talking to our clients about what I kind of think of as value engineering. And what I mean by
Mm.
that is you want to consider all of the variables, right? Cost is one of them,
Sure.
but it's not the only thing, right? You need to consider what the impact to the customer experience is. You need to also not look at things as purely, what is my cost to resolve one chat inquiry or
Mm-hmm.
respond to one email?
Mm-hmm.
Because if the person, that you've interacted with ends up contacting you one or two or three more times for the same issue,
Mm.
not only is your actual cost to resolve that particular issue higher,
Mm-hmm.
you've created a really bad customer experience, which is likely to impact things like your net promoter score, or customer satisfaction, whatever you're
Yeah.
measuring, or customer effort score.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of these things kind of have to be considered. And that's where the value part comes into play. And
Mm-hmm.
what our customers find, is that often the voice channel, while it is the most expensive on, say,
Mm-hmm.
a per minute basis, if you look at
Yeah.
it that way, or on a
Yeah.
per call basis versus a
Mm-hmm.
chat, what our customers find is that often those interactions are resolved more quickly. They take fewer
Mm-hmm.
minutes. There's less customer effort involved, in many cases, and a higher first contact resolution. And first
Mm.
contact resolution, of course, is the percent, or the the number of inquiries that are resolved the first time, and that's very
Mm-hmm.
important. Because if you look at customer surveying, what customers say is they want to interact with a company that's empathetic, that understands who
Yep.
they are and why they're calling, a
Yep.
company that cares about them and is
Mm-hmm.
committed to resolving the issue, and a company that respects their time.
Mm-hmm.
And, people don't feel like their time is respected if they've had to contact two or three or four or five times to
Yeah.
get an issue resolved. So, there are certain use cases where email, I think, is really good. That,
Mm-hmm.
if you need a customer to provide you with documentation of
Sure.
something, right? That could be a
Mm-hmm.
great channel. And that's a great
Mm-hmm.
use case where, yeah, email could work well. So could in-app document capture. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
probably like a best in class thing.
Mm-hmm.
But, not everyone has that. There's a technology element there. Email is kind of a lowest common denominator thing.
Sure.
Chat, I think best practice there is if you implement chat as sort of an in-app thing, or
Mm-hmm.
at least authenticated chat where you're interacting with the customer.
Mm-hmm.
um, there is a risk management element there, because chat could be a lower cost channel also for fraudsters to use, so that's
Right.
one of the realities there.
Mm-hmm.
um, but if it's authenticated chat and it's in a trusted environment where you can have a real conversation via chat
Mm-hmm.
with the customer about their account,
Mm-hmm.
that can work for certain kinds of inquiries. But when you think about those emotional inquiries that we talked about earlier, the things where customers are looking for reassurance,
Mm-hmm.
often that's difficult to do in a text environment, and that's where voice really shines. So, kind of the bottom line, I would say, is that you've got to think about it from a value engineering standpoint, and think about not just what is the cost per
Yeah.
contact that I have here, but
Mm-hmm.
what is the overall cost of this? And by overall cost, I mean the cost to the customer perception of your
Mm-hmm.
product and your company, first contact resolution, customer effort. All of those things become really important.
That is really interesting because just to double click into it a little bit, I guess I hadn't really been thinking about it exactly in those terms. I love the term value engineer, and I think that's fantastic. And the thing that it makes me kind of think about is, to your point, a very sort of surface level way of looking at this would be to look at all the different channels and go, how much does each one of these channels cost me every time someone uses it? And that's like a very surface level metric. But then you dig under the surface and you realize, I would imagine that, like, hey, so chat's inexpensive every time someone chats with us. But if someone has to chat with us for 20 minutes to try to get to a resolution or an answer on the thing they're looking for, that can actually be a lot more expensive than what we might be anticipating from a chat perspective. Whereas someone who got an email or did a quick voice call or whatever might be able to get to a resolution faster. And so, like, raw cost per contact versus like length of time it gets to resolution, even if I'm just looking at it from a cost perspective, that's a deeper, sort of more nuanced consideration around that, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think the right way to look at it isn't, on a per channel basis is, but to
Yeah.
think about what is the driver for a contact. And I think a lot of fintechs have the instinct like, hey, let's set up a chat bot. Let's
Yeah.
try to kind of hide our contact information. Let's force everyone to try to first interact with this chat bot.
Oh God, I can't
And
tell you the number of times I've interacted because I experiment with a lot of fintech apps as part of my
sure.
my job, and I sometimes actively feel like there's some force hiding behind the screen, like moving the phone number off of the page right before I scroll down to get. It's like spooky sometimes how much I feel like that's being moved away from me, and maybe I'm over personifying this experience a bit, but I completely empathize with that frustration of like I just want to talk to someone for like 2 minutes and I can't do it.
Yeah, and that's where, look, a lot of fintechs are operating products that have relatively low operating margins. So the flip side of things,
Yes,
they've got to be thinking about,
they have to
how
be
do I
savvy about
do
this.
this?
Hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And so, the chatbot idea is not entirely a bad one, but
Mhm.
I think there too, that's where you have to look at automation and say, well, how can we do this in a way that actually supports the customer experience and just doesn't frustrate the customer?
Yes. Yes.
And,
No, I
you
think
know,
that's right.
yeah, one of the ways we look at that is, first of all, on the chatbot side, if someone starts asking questions about, say, fraud or disputing a transaction or
Hmm.
something along those lines, it's not helpful to try to drag them through frequently asked questions and other things. You're going to have to talk to that customer. So
Right.
the best practice would be to just immediately get them connected with someone who can help them, right? Don't make
Hmm.
them go through a process where they're not going to be able to self-serve anyway, or even if you did allow someone to self-service disputes, there are some friendly fraud issues that come into play, and
Hmm.
potential avenues for fraudsters to
Hmm.
um, kind of attack
Yeah.
the fintech. So those probably aren't recommended, but even then, legitimate customers, even if given a self-service option, often want to talk to a person in those kinds
Hmm.
of settings. And we know that. So don't
Hmm.
drag someone through something they don't want to do. But to kind of take things a step further, when we're looking at self-service,
Yeah.
I think our best practice is to first look at the account, right? Look at someone's
Hmm.
account. And if you can predict why they're contacting you, don't
Yeah.
make them tell you, go to them with that, right? And
Yep.
a simple example, if someone's recently had a declined transaction on their account, they tried to go to an automated fuel dispenser, let's say, and a lot of
Yeah.
fintechs limit um, how their accounts get used there, or
Hmm.
fuel dispensers will have say they'll
Some
authorize
restrictions.
$100, that, yeah,
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
kind of thing, and people don't understand how that works behind the scenes. So from the
Right.
customer's perspective, hey, I have enough money in my account, I've got
Hmm.
$50 and I'm planning to buy $40 worth of gas, no problem, until
Right.
they go to a fuel dispenser that's trying to authorize $100, right? But they
Right.
don't know that
Right.
that's happening. So
Right.
those kinds of things. So if that's happened, right? If they've
Mm-hmm.
got a declined transaction and now they're contacting, whether via chat or phone, that's almost certainly the reason that they're contacting, the company. So why not just say like, hey, you know, Alex, we see you've recently had a declined transaction. Is that why you're contacting us today?
Mm-hmm.
Probably they'll say yes, right?
Mm-hmm.
If so, you do have, I think, a good pathway there to service that contact in an
Yeah.
automated way, right?
Yeah.
And we've done a lot of this, like in IVR development work on the
Mm.
phone side, automated phone systems, no one's
Mm-hmm.
favorite, but sometimes they are. And we do customer satisfaction surveying based on IVR interactions
Mm-hmm.
too.
Mm-hmm.
And we found that we can deliver really good IVR experiences where people say they're happy
Mm-hmm.
when they're proactive. We didn't make people use a clunky, voice system. Tell us why
Right.
you're calling. We didn't catch that. Please say it again, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh
We
God,
didn't
you're
get
you're
someone.
giving me like Vietnam like flashbacks to bad customer experiences I've had before. Yeah, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's so common, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
but if you can bring it up front and say like, "Hey, we see this has happened. Is this why you're calling?" Yes. Great. Now you've actually built a certain, even without the human element, you've built a certain amount of
Yeah. Wow,
trust with.
they knew why I was calling. That's pretty impressive. Yeah.
Exactly. And
Mm-hmm.
then people are more likely to listen to the explanation that you can give via an IVR. Equally, it could happen via chatbot.
Sure.
And take that and go, oh, okay, so that's why this happened. And here's
Mm-hmm.
how I could resolve it next time. Right.
Yep. Yep.
So I think, looking at things like that is really the
Mm-hmm.
right way to look at it. Kind of
Mm-hmm.
think holistically about what is the context of why this person is contacting us. Now let's make it easy for them to resolve the issue. Not just one size fits all. Everyone's got to go through this chatbot. The chatbot gets 2 or 3 attempts to try to resolve the issue.
Yeah.
That can create really painful experiences that are needlessly painful.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad you mentioned the multiple attempts thing because I think I don't know that there's anything that frustrates me more as a consumer than when I try to use whatever the channel is that you've put in front of me and it doesn't work and you don't immediately escalate me to a channel where this will work, right? Like I hate having to repeat myself essentially. And I don't think I'm alone. I imagine that probably shows up a lot in the customer satisfaction surveys that you do. You have sort of verged us into a new area that I wanted to ask you about, which is resolution and that sort of ability to predict why people are calling. And this kind of gets into the back end of the systems and how they're engineered and how data is shared and the ability for these systems to talk to each other. And I think one thing that maybe would catch some listeners by surprise, perhaps, is that obviously, I think we all know banks are very siloed and have, sort of independent lines of business for their different products that are sort of run as their own little businesses within the bank. They rarely talk to each other. This is why things like cross sell or other things are very hard inside of banks. I don't think we think about fintech companies in a similar vein, right? Because I think in our popular imagination, fintech companies are all seed stage startups where it's just 12 people sitting in a apartment and they're all working collaboratively on this product, and the CEO is also the customer service person who's answering emails from customers. But when we scale up from that, and I imagine this is the category of fintech companies that you guys work with a lot, as you start to scale up, even fintech companies run into a lot of these same sort of organizational challenges where suddenly you have multiple products that are managed by different groups and there do start to become some of these silos. So can you kind of talk about what you see for fintech companies that have scaled up and some of the challenges that creep in around product silos, systems not talking to each other, and like what can impact customer service and the ability to resolve those customer service inquiries?
Yeah, great point and great question. First of all, I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn about the amount of fragmentation that exists within the technology space for
Yeah.
fintechs. A
Yeah.
lot of fintechs are not building their own payment processing platform,
Right.
certainly. There's a
Right.
lot of, you know, kind of pseudo legacy systems, maybe not as legacy as what exists on, the core banking side, but still a lot of systems that have,
Mm-hmm.
really developed over the last 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them don't have the kinds of APIs available that you might expect. And
Mm-hmm.
some payment processors do have APIs, but kind of resist opening them up to their clients for a
Mm-hmm.
variety of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely not the kind of open framework in a lot of cases that people might expect there to be.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is when someone's interacting, say, with a chatbot or, an IVR system, it's not a given that those systems are going to have a good holistic view of the whole account. They
Right.
might
Right.
not, have all of the data on transaction activity. They might not have all the CRM data. Often, the CRM tool tracking sort of, what contacts the customer has had recently is an entirely different tool separated from the platform.
Mm-hmm.
Often, a lot of fintechs have built their own mobile apps. And maybe customer facing technology,
Because
and
that's
so
more of
then
a point of differentiation for them typically.
yeah, absolutely. And
Mm-hmm.
then they have their own data associated with those tools. So,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes there's profile data, demographic data, other things that could be helpful, in self-servicing
Mm-hmm.
that's yet another system and another layer. And then
Mm-hmm.
there could be other systems layered on, to help with compliance of certain
Mm-hmm.
elements and risk management and lots of other things, right? And so what you end up with is just a lot of fragmentation or kind of silos within the technology space that
Mm-hmm.
make it purely difficult for technical reasons to provide kind of a really seamless experience for a
Mm-hmm.
customer. So that's kind of the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that in some ways could be, costly to resolve, but it's technical, so it can be resolved.
Sure.
Then there are the human silos, right? And this
Right.
is where, those are the hard ones truly to break down because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, it's not a question of money or effort. It's how do you get people to work together? That's not
Right.
always an easy question, right? And I think this is where big banks obviously struggle.
Mm-hmm.
There's silos and, things can become political as organizations
Right.
grow, et
Right.
cetera.
Right. Everyone has
And I
different
think
incentives. Yeah.
absolutely. And for organizations that are scaling, this, no matter what kind of organization it is, that's always going to be an issue is
Totally.
kind of silos and, the politics behind it. And even
Mm-hmm.
if there are no politics, it's just people get busy and get really focused on what they're working on and don't necessarily give consideration to others. This all happens in fintechs too. And as
Yeah.
fintechs scale, they're often hiring quickly and often hiring, by the way, from banks. So,
Yeah. Sure.
they're,
Right.
which makes sense, but, there can be a little bit of a predisposition to these silos to begin with there.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I would say that I think, is impactful here is that a lot of fintechs are trying to figure out, quite frankly, how to become profitable.
Right.
And part of that, and one of the approach that I think a lot of leading fintechs are taking is, well, great, let's start offering different types of products, right?
Yeah.
Maybe
We're
we start,
rebundling.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's how banks make money too,
Sure.
right? And
Sure.
no secret, banks make a lot of their money on the lending side,
Mm-hmm.
possibly fees, but a lot of fintechs are low fee and have no
Yeah.
lending products. So naturally, a lot of fintechs are looking at, different kinds of lending products that they can add.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are looking at investing, maybe certain types of insurance, et cetera. And this is where I think the silos most naturally occur and are most difficult to break down because now you're bringing in people that are subject matter experts in different types of products. If you're going to offer an investment product, you're probably naturally going to start hiring people from that space. But
Mm-hmm.
great, that's a very different skill set than offering core banking. And so silos very naturally develop there. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's even the additional complexity of, um, systems-based silos that happen
Hmm.
because the systems that are going to support an investing product, let's say, or
Hmm.
maybe an insurance product or even a lending product are typically going to be different than the systems used for say a debit product. And so when you start bundling things together, now you've by an order of magnitude complicated both the system side of things and the human side of things. And by the way, now you start to look a lot more like a bank in terms of the challenges that you face.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And so building off of that point, then I think one thing that's interesting about banks is despite their siloed nature, and they are horrifically siloed. I've navigated a few of those silos in my day, and it's kind of unbelievable until you really experience it up close. Despite that challenge, banks I think have developed models for overcoming that, right? And I think one again, let's revisit like the branch as sort of an example of this. One of the things, again, say what you will about branches and how important they are, but one thing I find to be pretty effective about branches is in a lot of ways they supersede everything else, right? And so it kind of goes to this idea of ultimately we want to drive resolution for the customer. And one of the things that's nice about the branch is when you go into the branch, it's the people in the branch who own that customer relationship. And so, regardless of what products they own from the bank, regardless of where they might have been sent if they went to digital, maybe you have two different apps that you have for like your investment products and your banking products or whatever. But when they come into your branch, I generally find banks do a pretty good job of saying, this is one customer in our branch. The loan officer or the teller or the customer service agent who's working with them, we're going to put systems in place in front of them. We're going to have a CRM. We're going to have ways of pulling all this together. And we are going to give them, and again, you go through authentication and managing risk and stuff. But once this customer is authenticated and we know what they need and we need to be able to help them, we're going to give that customer service resource in the branch really robust abilities to solve problems and to kind of traverse silos and make sure the customer walks out of the branch satisfied. Now, obviously, that same sort of approach of kind of bringing things back together in the branch and trying to make that kind of a central point of sort of interaction and resolution, that's not going to work for fintechs in quite the same way because they don't have branches. But can you speak a little bit about the best practices you see for fintech companies that are scaling up who are trying to solve for some of these siloed challenges?
For sure. Well, I think another way to say that someone can walk into a branch and no matter what the issue is get help
Yeah.
is that the person in the branch is taking ownership, probably radical ownership of that
Yes.
situation and saying like, you know what, you're standing in front of me, I'm going to help you. And by
That's
the
right.
way, if I worked for a legacy bank and managed the branch banking network, that'd be my mantra because that's how
Hmm.
we can compete in that case, right? Is like
Yep.
radical ownership. Someone standing in front of you, doesn't matter if it's a product you're not directly responsible for, haven't been fully trained on. We'll make internal resources available for you, a help desk, whatever it is, but you don't walk away until that issue is resolved, right? Because that's a
Right.
huge differentiator. But
Totally.
that same thing can happen on a telephone, right?
Yeah.
And this is where I think fintechs do need to learn from that and say, sure, we can't replicate in a cost-effective manner
Hmm.
the in-person element of it, but what we can replicate is sort of the radical ownership of an issue element.
Mm.
And this is where I think fintechs can even differentiate because in a lot of cases, legacy banks have built a certain amount of bureaucracy that starts
Hmm.
to creep in,
Hmm.
in terms of well the whole infrastructure. But if someone needs to get an issue resolved, there's often a bureaucratic process, there are layers of
Yeah.
people involved, et cetera. And someone at the branch network typically can be provided with an internal help desk who can maybe expedite some of these things.
Hmm.
But I think on the fintech side, by thinking about really strong process design to make sure that there are rapid escalation paths to make
Hmm.
sure that issues can be resolved quickly. That's something that
Hmm.
they can do.
Hmm.
B, you kind of train people like, hey, we're going to have this radical ownership model where when I'm talking to someone, I own that issue. I'm not going to transfer them around to three different people. Customers hate that. There's
Oh yeah.
nothing that customers hate more than being transferred. That's just not a great setup. And if
Totally.
they have to be transferred, it had better only be one time.
Right.
And I think if you've ever called your bank, you've probably had the experience of being transferred potentially more than
Oh,
once.
I definitely have. I definitely.
Yeah,
Sorry, we can't do that, but let's send you over to this person. They might know the answer. So no,
right.
I completely agree with that model. I think that makes a lot of sense, and it does again speak to this kind of advantage I think that fintech companies can carve out, which is, you know, we are going to take ownership over this relationship. I actually did have an experience recently with a fintech company who I will not name, but they did a great job, and they are, I will say, a very engineering oriented shop, and so they think very much in terms of like, can I engineer every possible thing out of this product so that I'll never get these customer service calls? And yet, when I did reach out to them, and I think it was via email, actually, I didn't talk to someone, but I was exchanging emails. It was with a person who worked for the fintech company. And what was so cool about it was I had sent them this thing. They were like, okay, I need to get a little more information. So email was a good channel because we were sort of exchanging documents and things. And then the issue kind of resolved itself actually outside of the customer service interaction. But what was so cool was the person I was working with, she emailed me multiple times proactively when I didn't respond, going, hey, I just want to make sure we're taking care of you. Have you found out anything about this? Is there anything I can do? And like, she didn't stop until I had responded and said, actually, we got this figured out. Thank you so much. And then she closed the interaction in a very professional way. But it was that radical ownership of like, I was her biggest problem and she wasn't going to let it out of her teeth until she knew it was solved. And it was a pretty cool example of what you're talking about, where fintech can take that same approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I think that really is, from my point of view, the way to compete with a branch banking network
Yes. Yes.
is that model, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it gives you, from a customer standpoint, you feel like, great, I didn't need to walk into a branch because I was taken such good care of in this instance. What a great customer experience.
That's exactly right. And I think the only difference really between a branch and doing it via email or phone is, in a branch, I sort of feel like they kind of have to help me because I'm a person standing in their building and I'm not going to leave until they help me. And the concern you always have with email or phone is they don't have that same level of accountability. So I think that radical ownership and that idea of when someone calls us or sends us an email, we treat it the same way as someone standing in our building refusing to
Yeah.
leave. We're going to help this person. Let's wrap up by let me sort of asking you a future looking question. If you think about the next 5 to 10 years, and you've done a good job sort of illustrating where fintech is, we're rebundling, we're trying to sort of move to a more sort of profitable model. Like fintech is maturing in a lot of ways and scaling up. When you think about where fintech is and where it's going over the next 5 to 10 years, what should we be watching for as it relates to kind of customer service? Are there any kind of things that you think might become issues or potentially become sort of success stories or areas where fintech makes a lot of progress?
Yeah. So I'll give the 5 year outlook. Hard to
Sure.
say what's going to happen in 10 years, right?
Tell me
But
what's going to be in 100 years. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
who knows what unforeseen things happen on your side, right? But
Yes.
jokes aside, I would say that you know obviously Gen AI is going to be integrated more and more to into our daily lives in all kinds of products, and I
Yes.
don't think that financial services is an exception to that, right?
Yep.
So that's part of it. I think we're
Mhm.
going to see more of that. Where we've seen it, though, and where I think it's really a best practice, is to say, how can we use Gen AI? And this is what we're focused on with our clients. How can we
Mhm.
use Gen AI not to necessarily just replace the human in all cases, which can
Mhm.
lead to the same frustrating experience that a chatbot provides, but
Mhm.
how can we use it to make those people better? Because I'm sure you've had, you know, plenty of customer service interactions in your life where you've talked to someone who really didn't understand what you were asking for, didn't really know how to resolve it, and you found yourself 10 minutes later going, this is really frustrating. I don't feel like I'm even getting anywhere here.
Totally.
And so that's kind of an example of where technology can help. One of the things that we've actually built that I think is really interesting is on the voice side. Using AI, we listen to calls in real time and help guide the agent by, kind of sending them to the right knowledge articles. It's something that we can use to also try to detect social engineering, that sort of thing. So I think what we'll see is interactions actually getting better, but powered by technology, including Gen AI, but not only, other technologies as well. I think on the product side, fintechs are releasing increasingly complex products to try to compete with banks, find ways to become profitable. And that's going to make the customer service experience for fintechs more complex. I think the model we were talking about, sort of that idea of ownership and an interaction, is going to become more and more important. I think fintechs are going to increasingly try to differentiate, their customer bases in the same way that banks do with different, types of relationships, and might even look at, sort of account manager models. We've seen some of our partners, for their highest value accounts kind of move to a somewhat more dedicated approach to providing service, just like a bank would do for some of their highest value customers. And I think that becomes important too. So I think we're going to see a maturation of the service experience. And to me, the question, if I'm a leader at a fintech thinking about strategy for service, is how do I differentiate against the banks that I'm ultimately competing against? And I think we'll probably see some amount of consolidation in the fintech space. There are certainly leaders, in the space, and they're going to see banks increasingly as their competitors, not just other fintechs. So the question is how do I differentiate? And I think, there's a lot of things there. Technology is certainly part of it, but I think, where the human connection still exists, which is only a small fraction of, customer accounts in a given month, but where that interaction does exist, how to use that to differentiate, against a traditional bank, to make sure someone doesn't start thinking gee, this was really unsatisfying. I think it would be great if I could have walked into a branch. You don't want that to pop into someone's mind to begin with, because you're not going to be able to compete with that, right?
No, I think that's exactly right. And that is not only a great place to leave this episode, but it is an awesome teaser for the future episodes that are going to be running in this series, where we are going to touch on a number of the different topics, including generative AI that Corey mentioned. Corey, thank you so much for carving out the time to talk with me about this. I feel a million times more educated on the intersection of customer service and fintech. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Alex. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in to What Customers Want. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. We'll be back next Thursday with more insights on what truly matter to customers. See you then.